Hi, my name is David Harding, and I'm here today to talk to you about diverging perspectives on the role of the Chief Information Officer. And this is a paper centering on an analysis of UK advertised CIO job adverts. By way of a brief introduction, I have over 25 years experience of working in industry, initially focusing on the manufacturing sector. Over the years, I've progressed through being an ERP or an SAP consultant into more broader supply chain project management type roles, and eventually with a heavy focus on transformation advisory via program management. I'm nearing completion of my part-time PhD at the University of Cranfield here in the UK, and I intend to use the outcomes from the research to develop a new CIO advisory practice. I'm here today to talk to you about Chief Information Officers, and my broader research question is asking how can CIOs remain effective in today's new digital environment? So before I talk about our analysis, let me just remind you of the situation of Chief Information Officers. Research shows that the role is in fact highly tenuous, and in fact the word ambiguous has been used quite a lot. And there are many reasons for this, but to summarize those reasons, we can talk about the establishment of ever more dynamic business environments, which are now largely enabled through digital technology. So lead times have reduced, customer expectations have increased, and the combination of globalization and the advent of big data are all adding to the mix of ever more dynamic environments and shorter lead times for companies to respond to those environments. In parallel with this, as the role has evolved since the 1980s, the CIO has largely changed from being a technology-enabled manager or a technology-focused manager more towards being a strategic resource for many companies. And throughout that transition from technical manager to strategic business leader, there's been a clear correlation between the CIO's role and business technologies. So in other words, as business technologies have become more important and more central to most business strategies and most business operations, then the CIO's role has ascended. However, one of the problems with this is that as the role has evolved, then so has the number and frequency of change in expectations of the CIO's role. So some see the CIO as being a technical manager, some see the CIO as being potentially perceived as the service desk manager, whereas others see the CIO as a technical specialist, potentially a chief technology officer who can talk to you all day about IT infrastructure. Whatever the expectation, one thing is clear is that there are many diverging perspectives on the requirements for the role. If we combine those diverging perspectives with the lack of available personal and professional development frameworks for the CIO, we shouldn't be surprised to hear that the CIO role is in fact fairly short-lived, tenures are relatively low, and there is a high turnover of CIOs in relation to other members of the top management team. In terms of trying to understand how we can address this ambiguity in the role and help secure the CIOs in post for longer as a result of these dynamic environments, we decided to take a look at what today's expectations of the role were, particularly here in the UK. If we could find a way of enhancing and stabilizing those expectations, then potentially we could align perspectives on the role. And if we can do that, we can improve our understanding of the purpose of the role, which in itself could lead to new opportunities for professional and personal development for incumbent CIOs. To start to understand what these perspectives are, we took a look at advertised UK CIO job adverts, and we compared those adverts with the body of knowledge just to see if we can identify any correlation or divergence in role expectation. The way we decided to do this was to collect job adverts over a 12-month period, and we decided to use a qualitative tool called NVivo or NVivo 12 Plus to codify those job adverts to see if we can make sense of the requirements. In order to do this, we developed selection criteria. We wanted to try and make sure that we were consistently selecting similar CIO roles. And I'll come back to that point a little later. And we did this by monitoring a number of sources. There were two types of sources. There were generalist recruiters. So these are organizations such as LinkedIn and Indeed, who were advertising roles. And we also looked at specialist recruiters or advertisers, such as those more closely associated with headhunting and executive level type recruitment activities. We then monitored these various sources over a 12-month period, and we applied our selection criteria in order to make in order to create the ideal sample for the analysis. Once we'd collected the data, we then analyzed the data using 3 different techniques in NVivo. This was automated word frequency counts, so just a straightforward count of the most frequently occurring words in our sample. We then also applied automated clustering algorithms to the sample, and we finally applied auto-coding, which is using some of NVivo's AI algorithms to identify coding of various phrases. Now, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. And finally, we found that the auto-coding, whilst it gave us some quite good insight into the requirements for the advertised role, there was still a final set of manual activities to complete using Excel. Just very, very briefly, what we found was when we did the word frequency count, that the top frequency counts, if we restricted the top frequency count, to 75 words with a word length of 5, this gave us a first indication of the types of potential themes which were included in the sample. When we followed this up with word clustering, we started to find that we had greater transparency in the requirements and more insight. So we applied Jacquard's similarity coefficient to exercise the clustering algorithm, and we experimented with the outcome from that clustering analysis using things like dendrograms and word tree visualizations. And finally, once we've completed the auto-coding process with NVivo, we identified phrased themes, which I'll share with you in a moment. The final analysis helps us reduce and make sense of the adverts through 5 role perspectives. So in terms of results, if we read the diagram from left to right, when we applied our selection criteria, we collated 3,000 job adverts and were able to select 252. And what we found was that although most, in fact, all of the job adverts had the phrase CIO or Chief Information Officer in the advert title or somewhere in the job description, some of the roles were in fact clearly advertising for IT directors or even chief technology officers. And we would estimate that the number of adverts identified or advertised as CIOs were in fact more focused on infrastructure type roles and hence roles similar to the chief technology officer. And we did in fact a separate study to confirm over same time period the ratio of number of advertised CTO roles with CIO roles to confirm that. Not surprisingly, we found a lot of inconsistencies and also a lot of meaningless terminologies in the job adverts, and the job adverts were of a mixed quality. And I can perhaps best illustrate this. Some of the phrases were things like must be a heavy hitter, must have experience of digital transformation, must be able to focus on service development, must be able to work closely with customers as well. And in many cases, it wasn't clear whether that was an internal customer or an external customer. I say mixed quality as well there was one advert, for example, advertising a six-figure salary for somebody who must have hands-on uh, experience of Python programming. So a real mixed perspective there in terms of requirements for a board level type role. When we applied the word frequency counts, what we started to find is that although we started to notice a high count for some words, which were potentially representing themes for coding. So, for example, things like knowledge, skills, behaviors, qualities, and multi-attributes. A lot of those words, specific words, were still open very much to significant interpretation. So, for example, multi-attributes was referring to the word budget. There's a high count for the word budget, but that could be interpreted as having a requirement for knowledge of budget or IT budget setting or budget managing or even budget creation. So again, it still wasn't clear what the word budget referred to in the word count here. When we did our second analysis of word clustering, this gave us a marginally better insight than just the individual word counts. However, there were still some almost nonsensical word clusters. So, for example, word trust with opportunities and applications. But alternatively, there are also some quite useful clusters of words. So a good example was the word digital being closely associated with transformation, benefits, delivery, and change. When we then applied NVivo's auto coding and then conducted a separate manual analysis of those of the results of that, this really gave us some quite good in-depth understanding and detail as to the main themes being advertised for the CIO roles. So for example, auto coding gave us 30 auto codes. So this is things like service management, project management, leadership, so on and so forth. And there were within those 30 codes, there were a subcategory of some 3,000 phrases. When we took those into Excel and performed a further analysis, we were able to codify those subcategories into 5 role themes or perspectives. So the job purpose, i.e. the business context or the reason for the advert, the desired profile of the applicant, so what sort of qualifications they would be required to have or the level of previous experience, the type of knowledge they were required, so knowledge of business capabilities and finance, for example, the skills in how to actually apply that knowledge, and some of the behaviors needed to make sure that those skills could be enacted. Interestingly, out of all these steps, analysis steps, the word digital or phrases related to digital at any step of our analysis generally accounting for less than 3% of the entire sample. When we compare our findings with the body of knowledge to give us these two contrasting or potentially contrasting perspectives, we found quite quickly that there was some, although there were some areas of commonality, there were in fact some quite significant areas of misalignment between researchers and recruiters or UK recruiters. The diagram here shows or headlines some of the highest word counts and key themes in terms of the research and our sample from the UK recruiters. So if we focus on our 5 themes, I'll just take you through each of these in turn. So in terms of the purpose of the role or the business context or the reason you would recruit or need a CIO, well, the top 3 counts for recruiters or the job adverts was very much talking about a need for strategic alignment between business strategy and IT strategy. But I also talked quite extensively about the need for the CIO to help with business growth and business change. However, when we look at the body of knowledge, whereas researchers also agree that CIOs are important to achieving and maintaining strategic alignment, a lot of the researched area is very much focused on the effects of achieving that alignment with direct and measurable firm performance or firm level performance. If we look at the profile of the CIO, on the adverts, the profile was really very much centered around previous experience, which wouldn't be a surprise given the fact that it's an advertised job advert. However, the experience was quite generic, and it did tend to center on high counts for an applicant's previous level of rank or status. Mostly this was in terms of job title or whether they'd actually sat on the board of directors or not. So this was surprising because we expected to see a bit more in terms of the specific requests for types of experience or perhaps the number of years of experience, and this was largely absent. When we compare this to the body of knowledge, researchers talk about a CIO's profile in terms of characteristics, so their age or their sex or their educational level, but they also focus very much on aspects of social capital. So the CIO's prior knowledge and how they use that knowledge to influence and develop relationships with their peer groups. If we look at CIO behaviors, again, although the word leadership counts very highly from both perspectives, what was clear from the job advert analysis is that this was actually talking about leadership of the day-to-day running of the IT department, so an operational type focus as opposed to a more sort of strategic focus. And a way to kind of think of this is when we compare with the body of knowledge, this is leadership of the IT department with a very heavy inward focus to the organization. And if we contrast that with the perspectives shared by researchers or investigated by researchers, the general conclusion is that although there are different explanations or definitions of leadership, so things like social and motivational leadership or transformational transactional leadership, the general consensus is that CIOs need to be able to flex their leadership styles to be able to manage both outwardly focused requirements or demands, while simultaneously manage inward or lead inwardly to make sure that the IT department remains aligned to those demands. On the last two areas, or last two themes, so skills, recruiters or the job adverts very much talked about the CIO being able to manage the day-to-day operations of the IT department, but also to be able to deal with innovation and change, again, almost exclusively within the IT department and for the IT department. So this isn't business change, this is very much IT change. If we look at the skills talked about in the body of knowledge, there's a significantly long list of skills listed there, and you could argue whether those are in fact all skills. There's a lot of mixed up terminologies, including using the word or interchanging the word skill with competence and vice versa. But generally speaking, the body of knowledge does talk about the CIO being skilled in being ambidextrous or be able to flex their activities in response to the changing environment. And in addition to that ability to flex and to manage change strategically, CIOs are also expected to be able to educate and influence broadly and widely across the extended enterprise. Finally, if we look at our knowledge theme, recruiters expect CIOs to understand business requirements and business systems, service management and project management, which really isn't a surprise given that the requirement is for them to manage the day-to-day operations and be very inwardly focused. However, in the body of knowledge, researchers talk about the CIO to have strategic knowledge of the business and of the IT, but not just in a sort of splendid isolation. Knowledge is also required to understand the relevance of strategic business knowledge and strategic IT knowledge in the context of firm level performance, so tangible measures of financial performance, for example. If we step back now, having compared these two perspectives on the CIO's role, it's clear that while there are some areas of agreement in the two perspectives, that there are significant differences in role perceptions. And to summarize, UK advertised recruiters, UK CIO recruiters, which I'm taking or we're taking as being a potential representation of CEO or top management team requirements for CIOs, very much require their CIOs just to keep the lights on and to keep operations running smoothly. Whereas researchers and the broader body of knowledge expect the CIO to be influencing strategic-driven change, not only across from the perspective of IT, but also out into the business. What was also very surprising is, particularly from a job advert analysis, is the lack of acknowledgement of the relevance of digital technologies to their not only to the future plans of the organization. So digital was rarely mentioned in the purpose of the job advert, but they've certainly not associated the CIO's role with digital technologies in any meaningful way. This leads us to a call for further research. We're still planning on developing a more detailed perspective of role expectations, and we want to understand how those expectations will evolve, if they're going to evolve, in response to digital technologies. And perhaps more importantly, what would therefore be the relevance of certain CIO personal attributes in effectively setting and managing those changing expectations. So in other words, what skills or knowledge or education or coaching and help do CIOs need to remain relevant in today's dynamically changing environment as fueled by digital technologies? Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful. Are there any questions?